Good morning. My name is Marcia Stromgren, and you've tuned in to Just the Facts. I want to welcome Art Johnston, former school board representative from the 4th District in the city of Duluth. I want to welcome you here this morning, and thanks for coming in, Art.
Great to be here as usual, Marcy. Thank you.
Art had a very interesting 8 years representing his constituents on the school district, and we have a little bit more to tell because really the saga has not ended. When you request information from a government entity, data practices require them to give you the information that you're asking for. But is it surprising to anybody that the Duluth School District denied him that right? So Art decided, okay, I'm going to look at the law and I'm going to do something about this. I fondly call Art Johnston the Energizer Bunny because he keeps on going. And he has some very interesting things to share with us this morning. And so I'm going to let you begin where you want to get started, Art. It's tell the folks what was the outcome of the attorney that you had to hire. One more time, hiring an attorney. And this time, they couldn't deny what you were asking for. So let's go ahead and talk about that.
Well, thanks, Marcy, for having me here. It's this has been going on a long time. Of course, I was on the school board for 8 years, and during that whole time, I was not given data that I needed. When you're on a board, you're responsible for policies, you're responsible for the financial well-being, you're responsible for hiring and firing the superintendent. And it's really hard to function properly when you're not given information. And I decided that when I was on the board, I decided not to pursue that legally because I was on the board. You always want to try to hope that things will get better. Of course, they all never did get better. They kept going downhill, and it was the board and the superintendent are just nasty people. But finally, after I wasn't on the board, last March, about a year ago, I decided to file 4 data requests, 2 of them that I'd filed numerous times before. And there was the 2 that I filed before was I wanted information on the $12 million in change orders that Johnston Controls, which is the contractor that built the red plan, was given without board approval and without nobody even knowing about it till I happened to find out about it. The other information I wanted was information on the central property that's been sitting there. When they did the red plan, they closed the newest school we had, which was the central property, and that's still closed. We were never told about offers that we had from it except for a couple. So I wanted to get information on who was asking for that property, why did not the school sell it? And that's, incidentally, it's still sitting empty after 8 years now. It's sitting empty. The property values went down enormously since it was closed back in, I believe, 2011. So I asked for those informations. I asked for 2 other bits of information. One was, how does the school deal with data practices? Because since they had never responded to these, I'll get into more things, they never responded to my data ever when I was on the board. What legal grounds that they had to stand on? What legal firm was advising them not to respond to me? What legal firm was advising them to violate the law? So I asked for that information, and I also asked for information about me. That's called a subject data practice request. And so those were the 4 things that I had. Okay, I filed those in March. School district did not even acknowledge that. Again, for the numerous times, for the 48th time, I've actually got count of all the times they did not respond to my formal data request. And so then this time I decided to take some action on it. I decided to start the legal process because I think schools, like everybody else, should follow the law. Just because they're a school teaching children doesn't mean they can violate the law repeatedly. So the process is that there's a Minnesota law called the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act, Chapter 13, part of Chapter 13 of Minnesota laws, and it's based on the Freedom of Information Act from the federal government, and I'll talk about that here as we go on the meeting. I can talk a lot about the history of that, but let's just talk about Minnesota now. Minnesota, I think everybody knows, does not enforce the law. Minnesota itself, they will not bring any action against entities that clearly violate the law or when people are saying they're violating the law. So what happens? You as a citizen don't get responded to. So they set up a process. It used to be called IPAD, now it's called Data Practices Office. They have a couple attorneys down there that you can call up and say, they didn't respond to me, and they will say, oh gee, that's too bad, here you can do this and that, and we'll talk to them, and if they don't get any advice from that, they will tell you, maybe if they will tell you, if you talk to them long enough, that there's some steps you can take as a private citizen. One of those being that you can ask for an opinion from them, an advisory opinion from the Data Practices Office, which is Department of Administration in the state. You can ask for an advisory opinion. And of course, after I talked to the lady there and kind of getting the normal bureaucratic, you can do this, and I think that she may be called up to district, and nothing ever happened. So then I asked them formally for an advisory opinion. I got that back from the Department of Administration in June. It said that the school was not complying with the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act.
Well, at least they did something.
Well, they did that.
Yeah,
I mean,
that was commendable, or should I
right.
say, that's kind of sarcastic, but hey, we're paying these two attorneys for what?
Well, I'm assuming I think they have two staff down there. They're attorneys. I'm assuming they're making $100,000 a year, and okay, they did some investigation, and they gave me an advisory opinion again that said that the school district was not complying. Okay, that's great. Okay, now what happens? Nothing happens unless you pursue it further. You could pursue an administrative hearing. There's a bunch of caveats on that. Still costs $1,000 to start that, and even if you get that, even though the Data Practices Office said they were not complying, you can go to administrative judge and they will say the same thing again. Well, they weren't complying, and what happens then? Nothing. So at that point, I found an attorney, Bill Paul, local attorney here in Duluth, and I decided to file a civil lawsuit against the school district, which I did. And it's a little bit frustrating that the state of Minnesota does not enforce their own laws, even when their own administration departments say that the district wasn't complying. And why they don't do that, I don't know. I guess you could say that's the state of Minnesota. They don't really want. Remember, almost all governments are very opposed to transparency. They don't want them to know. They don't want us citizens to know what they're doing. Why is that? I don't know. Remember, I was a government employee for 20 years, and when we got information, we always told people in my agency exactly what they wanted. Occasionally I got in trouble by doing that, but hey, if people want something, I say, hey, give it to them. They're entitled to that. It's a lot easier just to give it to them than to go through get into big bureaucratic thing and take 6 months for them to go through the Freedom of Information Act.
Well, if I could say something here, government doesn't want you to know because they control you. When you don't know and you don't know how to go about doing anything, most people give up, and that's what they want. They don't want you to know because they have things to cover up. And I've seen this time and time again. I've read from attorneys from First Amendment rights people and all those different organizations that are out there fighting for people's rights. You have to hire an attorney to get information from the government that we pay for. And it's because they are being deliberately obtrusive of the information that they have. But Most people don't realize that, and they just give up, and that's what they want us to do. So we are ignorant, and we are stupid. And it takes somebody like you, Art, who knows the pathway to take, and you're not afraid to take it. So what happened after that point then, when you hired your attorney? How long did it take for you to get a settlement in this data practices information?
We filed the lawsuit in August. And at that point, despite the Department of Administration saying the school district did not comply, the school district still did not comply.
Surprise.
Yeah, and you're saying this is the law. The Department of Administration is saying they did not comply, and they still didn't comply. And we filed a lawsuit in August, and by September, they started giving me some data. And I have since got some of the data that I asked for.
Was
Not all of it.
was it 300,000 pieces of data, like the article in the Reader? Why they wouldn't give it to you? Because you wanted 300,000 pieces? I mean,
Well, let's laugh about that for a while. Government always has an excuse why they can't comply with the
exactly.
law.
Yeah.
So why they came up with $300,000 or 300,000 pages? Who knows? It's just all BS.
That's what their attorney said.
Well,
whatever.
well, of course. I mean, you can find out. There was no justification for that at all, and now it's really easy nowadays for most of it. When I was asking for emails, I was asking for documents. I wasn't asking for the minutes of the school board, say, for example. So if you ask all the minutes of the school board for the last 10 years, which my name is on, of course, maybe they came up with 300,000 pages. Well, I wasn't interested in public information. I was interested in information that involved, one, Johnston Controls change orders for $12 million, and that is should have been public information. There should not have been any. One of the things that we deal with in public data is there is one caveat: is private information can't be given out. Your
Right.
social security numbers,
Right.
your phone numbers, that kind of stuff can't be given out. So governments use that caveat as a way to not respond. They say, oh, well, this is all private data. No, it isn't. There's nothing about the Johnston Controls contract for $12 million change order that was private data. There wasn't one iota on that. And what did I get? I got 0 pages of information on that one, incidentally. 0 pages of electronic data. None of it had to be even looked at because there was no reason to redact private data. The information on the school district, the sale of the central property, there's no private information on that,
none.
nothing whatsoever.
No.
That took 0 redaction. All I had to do was go back, do a query, get their IT people to do a query, and get the information and send it to me. And so the 300,000 pages is just laughable.
It's very laughable.
And everybody knows that if you look at you do any search on the web, governments are going to hype and say, oh my gosh, that's an onerous effort to do this. That's BS. It is not onerous. If they were doing their job, I should have been able to get that data in a week. I should have been able to get every bit of that data in a week. And it should have been able, it was really easy to redact any information that was given to me, and it wasn't hard at all. So that was, it's typical. What the school districts want to do is that I pursued it, and I'll give you what finally happened. We filed it for the law, 4 data practices that I filed back in March. Okay, we amended that complaint in December. We amended it to add 20 other data practices that I had black and white evidence that they had not complied with. Remember, the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act, the state doesn't enforce it. We've already talked about that, unfortunately. So what rights the citizens have? There is some things in the law, which we found out, I didn't know much about data practices until I filed the lawsuit, is that if there is a willful violation, the plaintiff, which was me asking for the data, is entitled to up to $15,000 in exemplary damages per willful violation.
Oh my goodness.
So we had 4 to start with. The Data Practices Office responded that they were violating the law. It was very clear that there were willful violations, not just violating the law because of incompetence. You could make that case too, but it was clearly willful because I filed them in March. I asked for an opinion, advisory opinion, and I got that in June. They still did not comply with it. They did not even start complying with it. They didn't even acknowledge that I did it until September. So it was clearly willful. So our lawsuit not only said they failed to comply, but there was a willful lack of compliance. We also adjusted the lawsuit too because we got, in September, they did give us some data. We also amended the lawsuit to say that they did not, they violated data retention policies. There's a big history of government data, starting with the Freedom of Information Act, starting with John Madison, our fourth president, who had lots of things. We can talk about that in just a sec. So there's a big history on what they should do, and they did not do it. And the data retention in the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota State Historical Society, there's a place called the Minnesota Archive. Mm-hmm. This is all set up by law. If you go on their website, it's really good. They say it's a right of citizens to know what their government's doing. You cannot destroy data unless it's been approved by the Minnesota Archive panel.
Okay.
So in addition to asking the willful violations, we also made the case that the school district violated the data retention laws.
So there is some information that is no longer in existence?
Well, they claim that they could destroy data after 3 years.
Oh.
That was their
Okay.
claim. Now, let's finish up the lawsuit, and I'll tell you what we did not finish up on that, and that's the data. But we said that they violated the data retention. They were willful violations. So then by the time we amended our complaint, we had 24 willful violations that we were claiming. I got black and white data. I would bring these requests into the superintendent's office, and they would stamp them. So I had all that data. I mean, it was black and white. Now I'd been doing this for the last, I guess, 8-9 years since I was on the board. And my lawyer indicated that there may be a 6-year statute of limitations on data requests. So the 24 that we eventually amended our complaint to were only the last 6 years. Originally, I had 45 ones that I had absolute black and white documentation that they did not comply with. And so we took my 45, we pared that down in the amended complaint, which we filed in December, down to 24. And we had that all black and white. We had every bit of paper that I brought in there. There was no question at all. I don't think it didn't go to court. So the school district's attorneys, the same ones who advised them, incidentally, probably advised them not to respond to me over the last 8 years, looked at that and said...
I bet you they were trying to get past that six-year filing.
Yeah, well, they're hoping that I would have went away and not done anything. You're right, Marcia. Even though I'm not on the school board, I'm a citizen. I know a lot about how schools operate since I was on the board for 8 years. And most of it is not particularly good. There's a lot of violations of data practices, a lot of violations of treating people with respect.
Their rights.
Yeah, and school districts, I think, are notorious for that. And so even though I'm not on the board, I have a lot of information that I gained. I'm going to be using that information for the rest of my life to try to make things better, because one of the things I know a lot about are school districts in Minnesota, and it's not a pretty scene. So anyway, we amended our complaint in December. We had 24. You just do the math, 24 times 15,000. Plus we had the data retention. We also connected the dots about the laws. We think that the data retention violations can also be tied right back into the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. And I did a lot of research myself. I had other people doing research for me, including my attorney and his legal assistant. And it got to be really interesting. And as soon as we filed that amended complaint, the school district immediately wanted to settle. obviously, because I think
knew
they knew that they were going to lose. Now, the hardest thing that I have about this is that I did settle without going to court. We wanted to go to court. We knew in Duluth that we would not win in Duluth. My lawyer and I were set to go to a court of appeals, if necessary, the Minnesota Supreme Court, because hey, this is Duluth. Everybody knows the Duluth court system is not going to do anything against the governments in Duluth. They're notorious for that. And my lawyer, first thing he told me, he said, "You were never going to win in Duluth." Yeah, I knew that. Hey, I've been in Duluth for 12 years. I know how the legal system works in Duluth. So we were expecting to go to a court of appeals. And I think without a doubt, we thought that we were going to win. But we were offered, the district, they started out offering us like $2,000 or $3,000. And we eventually got up to $55,000. And that was a small fraction. It should have really been 10 times that amount. But who wants to go to lawsuits? Nobody does. The point of me filing this lawsuit was to get the school district to comply with the law. Now, one of the things that in the settlement, they of course agreed that did not violate any laws, blah, blah,
yes.
blah. Mm-hmm. But one of the other things we got in the settlement, which was one of my requests, was, I'll read it to you.
If I can, while you're looking up that information, the school district is willing to forego an offer of $14 million for the old Central High School. Meanwhile, it is falling to disrepair, rack and ruin, broken windows, wonderful baseball and other types of athletic fields all growing up with grass, but they're only willing to give you a pittance of what they owe you for the damage that they have done and the lies they have told. I'll be bold enough to say that. It's their nature to be penny wise and pound foolish. They could have stopped this a long time ago. They wouldn't have had to pay you out $55,000 if they'd complied with the law that they are required to do. How interesting how they love to waste our money, folks. I hope you realize that's what you elect when you put certain people on school boards, is you elect people that love to throw away your money.
Well, they like to not respond to the citizens that are paying their way.
They're not accountable to us.
So let me read what they did acknowledge in our settlement. Was the district hereby affirms its obligation and agrees to follow all requirements outlined in the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act related to future data requests that it receives. Okay, that's not binding legally, and of course anybody will have to go through that, but the school district did acknowledge that in the future they will start complying with the law. I think that the $55,000 is not a large amount. I mean, it is for some people, but it's just, I've had a lot of legal expenses leading up to this, so I'm still in the hole when it comes to legal expenses. But yet it was something. Now, I was hoping, normally when a school district or any government entity is found to be it appears to be violating the law, willful violation of the law, and even though we made the settlement that they weren't guilty, what was the school board doing? We know they had several closed sessions about this because their attorney told us that, and the school board is not in charge of following the law. The person responsible for complying with the law is the superintendent. And the superintendent cost the school district $55,000 because willfully violating the law. They say, our insurance company, Liberty Mutual, the one you see on TV all the time, they're the ones that paid it. Well, of course, who pays insurance premiums? We all do. And somebody should be noticing in the school board that the superintendent violated the law. That should be enough to not renew his contract in the future.
And give him raises to boot.
And they're still paying him to go to college. And yet the Superintendent Gronseth was the one who was in charge of Minnesota government data practices by current policy and past policy. And he did not comply. And it was clear that it was willful. And but yet what's the school district doing? The school board doing? Nothing. he's still a superintendent. It's really embarrassing that somebody can be found and has to pay out a settlement because they violated the law, and absolutely nothing is changing in the school district. The superintendent is still there. The person who violated the law is still there. Now, one of the things we also got, they wanted me to have non-disclosure statements. They wanted me to say that I wouldn't say anything bad about anybody on the school board or the school administration or the attorney. We said, no, we're not gonna do that. So basically, I can say anything that I want about this. I will tell the truth from now till I die.
Muzzle the mouthpiece. I call that muzzling the mouthpiece. Does that sound familiar to anybody out there? But I want to stop you for a moment. The school board might not be the one responsible for the actions of the superintendent, but they are responsible for allowing him not to be accountable to them, and they just go along to get along with what he's doing. They don't, outside of you and Gary Glass and Alana, they don't ask any questions. They just go along with whatever he puts out there. I saw it for 10 and a quarter years, folks. I used to film the school district, so I'm very well aware of how they operate. And you, the electorate, voted for people who just let the superintendent get away with what he's doing because he's got them in his little pocket. Do I sum that up? Am I exaggerating, Art, or is that basically what's going on?
Well, no, you're not exaggerating. That's exactly what's going on. When I was on the school board, and you've got this on film. In fact, I was looking through the minutes when I found the Sunshine Resolution that we passed back in 2011. I brought up repeatedly that the superintendent was violating the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. The school board knew he was violating it. I brought it up, it's on public record, I brought it up numerous times. And yet the school board refused to act.
Right.
Now the superintendent clearly knew that because he was sitting in the room the whole time. And even though the law specifically says the superintendent is responsible for data practices in school districts. That's in the law. The school board was on notice because they knew that the school district was violating the law.
They were letting
the school district did not tell the superintendent start following the law. Nobody said that.
They didn't hold him accountable.
Yeah, and now of course the lawsuit. Now here they had to pay out $55,000, and the school board is still sitting there and being all the school board is in Duluth is cheerleaders. They do nothing else other than cheerlead. They have committees. They don't actually talk about anything on committees except what's given to them. They're all brain dead. Yeah, we'll say that because somebody should be telling us the school district has a bigger budget than the city does, and nobody has accountable. There isn't one person on the school board who asks the superintendent to be accountable, not one. And so it's sad but true. So it's only up to citizens like us to go through and ask that laws be followed. And let me talk a little bit about the history of data practices. And if I could quote a few things here that I put out in my press release. Government has always been, people always wonder, what is government doing? This isn't something new.
Probably don't want to know.
It hasn't just been the last year since I filed data requests. This has went on forever. I'll quote James Madison, the 4th president of the United States, back from about 1806. Remember, that's 200 years ago.
Before
over
my
200
time.
years ago. Anyway, this is a quoting from him. A popular government without information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power knowledge gives them. So it's pretty important information. I'll go back a little bit further. Back 1807, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of our country, and this is more to do with newspapers, and we can talk about that, but this is a really interesting quote from Thomas Jefferson, 1807. The man who never looks into a newspaper is better informed than he who reads them inasmuch as he who knows nothing is nearer to the truth than he whose mind is filled with falsehoods and errors.
Ooh.
Now, no, that's talking about newspaper, but you can say the newspapers, you can put that into boards, you can put that into school boards, you can put it into any
Yes.
government action. Now, how did this all start to change? How did we come up with the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act? This was based on the Freedom of Information Act, which everybody's heard about. That's a federal law. That law was passed in 1966, which is what, 50 years ago?
52.
50 years, 60 years ago. 62 years ago this was passed.
Yeah.
And the author of that was John Moss, California representative. And this is one of a quote from him. When it got passed, he said, "The right to speak and the right to print without the right to know are pretty empty." And it's the same thing. If you're on a school board and you don't have any right to know what's going on, how can you make decisions? How can that school board sitting up there right now be making decisions when they know that the superintendent is violating data and not giving them information? How do they know that? How can they do their job when they know the superintendent is violating the law, or has violated the law and probably is in the future? And here I'll quote President Johnston back in 1966 as well when this passed, and he says, "This legislation springs from one of our most essential principles. A democracy works best when the people have all the information that the security of the nation permits. No one should be able to pull curtains of secrecy around decisions." And I mean, those are pretty heavy-duty statements when you look at these are 60-year-old statements that were passed by the Freedom of Information Act. After that was passed, all states, I don't know the exact history, but all states were expected to also, states' government, of course, were expected to comply with government data requests, just like the Freedom of Information Act. That only applied to the federal government. All states then also passed laws, and I think we passed our law in 1970 in the state of Minnesota. And incidentally, during some of my research, we found out that there's been 8 instances where the Independent School District 709 has been up in front of the board of the Data Practices Office, now called, that they were there and they were held in violation of the Data Practices Act. And this has been going back to 1970. The first one the school violated was back in 1970. So they've got a track history of this. And incidentally, most of the people that were representing the school were the same law firm the school district now has.
Well, they're well versed in their obfuscation, aren't they?
Well, again, we wanted to bring up some of this information. But,
Yeah.
But another interesting thing, and getting up to date, back when I was on the board, you mentioned Gary Glass, who's a board member, extremely amazing person, extremely honest, integrity, ethical.
Did his homework.
He did his homework.
He did a lot of research, and before he spoke, he knew exactly what he was going to
Right.
say.
Him and I worked together a lot. One of my mentors, of course, is why I ran, was when I seen the way that the school board treated Gary Glass, and I ran for the board and won. But anyway, he actually introduced a motion which, believe it or not, passed, and it's really quite good. This is called the Sunshine Week Proclamation. Sunshine Week Proclamation occurs in March, and that's done by people, mainly newspapers, that are advocating for freedom of information. And let me read that to you, if I could. Maybe I'm taking too much time here, but it's really good.
No, you've got time.
Okay, this was passed on March 15, 2011 by the Duluth School Board. Whereas James Madison, the father of our federal Constitution, wrote that, quote, "Consent of the governed requires that the people be able to arm themselves with the power of which knowledge gives. And whereas every citizen in our participatory democracy has an inherent right to access to government meetings and public records, and whereas an open and accessible government is vital to establishing and maintaining the people's trust and confidence in their government and in the government's ability to effectively serve its citizens, and whereas the protection of every person's right to access to public records and government meetings is a high priority of the School Board of Independent School District 709, Whereas the School Board of Independent School District 709 is committed to openness and transparency in all aspects of its operations and seeks to set a standard in this regard. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the School Board of Independent School District 709 commits in a tribute to Sunshine Week, which commemorates the 261st anniversary of James Madison's birth, to work diligently to enhance the public access to government records and information, to increase information provided electronically and online, to ensure that all meetings of deliberative bodies under its jurisdiction and their committees are fully noticed and open to the public. That was passed when I was on the board in March 15th, 2001. Since then, I had 45 Data Practice Act requests, which were my contention willfully violated by the school district.
Now, if I can stop you for a minute, you're on a roll here.
Sorry, Marcy.
No, excellent. Let me ask you this question. Which of those school board members currently sitting on that board even know this exists?
Well, they should know because...
I know they should know. That's a moot fact. The question is, which of them actually know that it exists? Because obviously, if they do know it exists, they're violating it. But if they don't know it exists, well, they're just as ignorant as the next guy would be. So, maybe a little trip to the next school board meeting and reading that, I think you could get it done in 3 minutes, reading that in front of the board would say, this is your responsibility to hold the administration accountable. Are you doing your job? I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to go up there and do that because, no, we know they're not doing their job. Obviously, they're not doing their job. So,
well,
and they don't even, if they do know this, they're not doing their job. But if they don't know it, it's time to give them a little education.
Well, ignorance is not a justification. Ignorance is
No,
not
exactly.
a justification for violating the law.
No.
Now, the Minnesota, this motion that was passed by the school board in 2011, I'm sure nobody on the school board knows that now.
No.
But they certainly know that there's a Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. I brought it up repeatedly at board meetings. This is a law which governs all government functions in Minnesota. There is no justification why the school board members currently on the board do not know that law, particularly after my lawsuit. They should be holding the superintendent accountable. Instead, they're doing absolutely nothing.
Well,
So yes, the school board is accountable. When we took our oath of office, we said we would uphold all the laws of the state of Minnesota. That's in our oath of office that I gave when I was elected and first served on that. That's the oath of office that every elected official in the state of Minnesota says that they will uphold Minnesota law. The school board that is on there now, they're not upholding the Minnesota law because they're letting a superintendent violate it repeatedly and they're doing nothing about it. Just to give you another aspect of this, it's kind of sad that the Minnesota doesn't enforce this. Believe it or not, my $55,000 settlement was the largest settlement in the state of Minnesota on data practices, and it's been in place for 50 years.
wow.
$55,000 isn't much when it comes to keeping government accountable. It should have been something the school board noticed, but apparently they didn't. But Minnesota is doing nothing to change that. When I've talked to the Data Practices Office, they say there is nobody doing any surveys on how many governments are complying with it. There's been no surveys done in Minnesota about government compliance on this by the state. Now I'll go back and going to our neighboring state, Wisconsin. Wisconsin, which I happen to find out, you do a search on the web. Most states have groups, and this is both left and right politically, groups, want government transparency. It's very important. Everybody wants that. And Wisconsin also has a law, I forget the name of the law, but it's the same as the Government Data Practices Law based on the Freedom of Information Act. And it's interesting, they did a study back in 2017 that's called the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. And most states have something like this, sunshine institutions that monitor governments. And And in Wisconsin, they found that, well, actually, the former governor, Scott Walker, put on an executive order that said that all government agencies, except school districts, don't ask me why they were exempted, would respond within 10 days of government data requests. And this Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty found out that almost every government institution in the state of Wisconsin was complying. The schools was a big loophole, so they actually did a special study on the schools. They found that even most schools complied with the law within 10 days. Some of them notoriously, ones didn't, like the Milwaukee school system would not, Madison school system did not, but as a rule, most school districts even complied. So you get a neighboring state like Wisconsin who passed the same law as Minnesota does, and their executive branch said, all of you, which is under the executive branch, school districts, counties, state governments, state executive branches, would comply in 10 days. And in Minnesota, there's no
There's
limit.
no enforcement.
There's no limit, and it's very vague. The reason we got a settlement was it was clearly a willful violation. And
But they're not enforcing the law that's on the books. Let's
no.
face it, they're not enforcing the law.
And it's very sad that the state government in Minnesota, I mean, before I did this, when I was a school board member, I sent notes to the Attorney General, who used to be Lori Swanson. She did absolutely nothing. Sent them back and said, oh, these are independent school districts, they can do what they want. I sent a note to Rebecca Otto, former auditor of the state. She said the same thing, nothing. And there was actually a citizen petition to have the auditor's office audit.
Yes, I collected signatures for that.
Right, and she refused to do it.
Right.
Which is, I think, was violating the law.
What did they say? Excuse me for interrupting you, but I still remember this only too well. They said, we did not ask for an audit. That we went out there and got those signatures in clear understanding, as it was repeatedly defined by Lauren Martell, who clearly, he asked them, now, this is what I want. Is this, and what do I need to do it? So he got his directions from the state of Minnesota, and the attorneys came back and said, well, we weren't really asking for an audit. Yes, we were.
Well, that is such a travesty of justice in the state of Minnesota, done by the state auditor, who is an elected person who clearly violated the law. We should have taken them to court at the time. We didn't. The Attorney General did absolutely nothing.
I don't think any of us had the kind of money that was needed to pursue that. So.
Well, the interesting thing is that I did file a lawsuit.
Yes, I know.
And it was against the school district. It was so blatant that they made a settlement. The thing that I regret is that we didn't hold out for more money. I regret that we did not get things in there about data retention. We think it was clearly that they were violating data retention requirements. And I'm thinking that people in the future, it was quoted by the Duluth newspaper, they did a little bitty article, and that this was the biggest settlement of data practices in Minnesota. And the Duluth newspaper had a little bitty article this big.
Gee, does that sound like the Duluth News Tribune folks? No, they're always on the public side, right? No.
No, they set the narrative. They report on the narrative that all the governments want. There's zero investigative reporting in the Duluth News Tribune. The only investigative reporting we've got is by the reader, and that's it. There is no investigative reporting. The Duluth News Tribune is a disgrace when it comes to newspapers. And so they had a little article this big, the biggest settlement on data practices, and who usually is the biggest promoters of government transparency? Newspapers. But not the Duluth News Tribune.
Not our wonderful Duluth News Tribune. Is it any wonder most people of my age are dropping subscriptions? And if I can just digress momentarily here, I wonder who the clientele of the Duluth News Tribune is going to be in the future, since kids can't read, graduation gaps are increasing. Do you think they're going to have much readership in the future? And when we're all gone and we're not buying their paper anymore, people are going online. I mean, how are they going to stay afloat if they don't get more responsible to the public? I mean, don't they see what's coming? It's like they got blinders on.
Well, like again, paraphrasing Thomas Jefferson, you're better off having no knowledge than having knowledge which is false, which is what the Duluth News Tribune
Exactly.
does. Their reporting will only takes the narrative that's set by the school district, by the city government. They're infamous for that. Just read anything from John Ramos in the Reader, and you'll find none of that in the Duluth News Tribune.
No.
You do not find any critiques of government in Duluth News Tribune.
No.
All you do is they'll go back and continue the narrative that the government tells them to print, and it's very sad that I don't know. I think the level of journalism, that should have been headlines in the Duluth paper that somebody finally had a settlement on the Government Data Practices Act. The newspaper, I've talked to them about it a lot. Their former reporters know about it. They were sitting in all those meetings, how they violated the law. And you get other newspapers around the state like Marcia and the Timber Jay up in Tower. They used the same thing. They tried to get information. Small newspapers have journalists, investigative reporters that can actually do the job. Medium-sized papers there's no investigative reporting done. They report on car accidents and murders and
opioid
that kind of
addiction
stuff.
and all kinds of things like that.
Which is good.
Yeah, but let's get back to reporting the truth. You've got that big newspaper and you put all kinds of advertisements in it. You surely could have more than just a little blip about your lawsuit. You certainly can have more investigative reporting on the Duluth School District. I read many of those articles, and a lot of it was just blah, blah, blah. I'd sat through the meeting, and I got more meat out of sitting through the meeting than I could get out of the Duluth News Tribune.
Yeah, well, it's sad.
It's very sad.
Yeah, right. They don't report on things. The TVs do a little bit better. They monitor things, but they only have 1 minute.
1 minute.
1 minute. So they don't do any investigative reporting, obviously, and it's sad. But I think that people are looking. One reason I settled the lawsuit where we did is that I wanted to get information out. I did not have a gag order, obviously, as you can tell. I'm not gagged. I can talk about my settlement. And when I say that, I have to say that the school district did not accept any guilt at all. That's what we have in our settlement. But this is what it was. This is how is led up to that, is all the contentions that were there. And was that they made willful violations. And you'd think that people like the Duluth News Tribune would have done an article on it. Again, I was in contact with the reporters in the Minneapolis paper. They had interest on it. They had a fairly good article on it. And of course, it's on my website, so people can at least find some information. If they do a search, they can at least find it. And I'm hoping that the Data Practices Office, when people call up, they will tell. As far as I know, there's been 2 settlements in the state of Minnesota on data practices, believe it or not. There's only been 2 settlements, and as far as I know, 0 court cases because the governments always want to settle before they get in there. And now, most of the time, you're not going to hear about the settlements. They just settle, outside, so it doesn't become part of the public knowledge. There was one case. The other one was for $45,000 down by the city of Bloomington. And they had gag orders on that. Nobody could say what actually happened. In my case, we effectively took out the gag orders in the settlement agreement. So I can talk about anything, and I've already been talking to a couple other school districts. How can you go through and how can you get information which you as citizens need to know about your government? For example, if school districts are asking for referendum or excess operating levy, you should be able to get every information on that. And it's really, to me, it's sad that so many school districts do not give that information out. One school district I was recently at, they did not even distribute the review and comment on one of their proposed building referendums. And it's like, how can you do that? And people didn't know they had a Government Data Practices Act, which allows them to get that information. And of course, we know the state of Minnesota doesn't enforce it, but a very small lawsuit, a very inexpensive lawsuit by those school districts would have broken that information free. Of course, it's really sad that you have to bring lawsuits against your own government to get information which the law says you're supposed to have.
Well,
To me, it's really unconscionable that any government would operate that way. But hey, Minnesota, I think, is infamous for lack of responsive government. And at least in the federal sector, we can complain about that. I worked for the federal government for 20 years, and we had people who were called Freedom of Information officers or employees. That's all they did was comply with the Freedom of Information Act, and it's very unusual, I think, that people would not comply. And here we got the state of Minnesota that doesn't even enforce the law. And it's supposed to, they're the ones enforcing it, of course, and they don't enforce it, so it's obvious why they don't enforce it, because it's themselves. But anyway.
Well, I had many thoughts, but I can't remember all of your statements, but I'm going to go to this one because it's very clear to me. I home educated for 20 years. I saw obfuscation in kindergarten with my son, and I just got level feeling as a mother. My kid's going to get better than this. And we went a totally different route. We tried several different Christian schools. That didn't work, and I home educated. I was one of the pioneers in the state of Minnesota to help get that law through. But one of the things different between public education and home education is maybe we don't have degrees to teach those kids. But we know how to read. My generation was taught how to read. We actually had some critical thinking back then. I dare say it's not that we have bad teachers. They've been brought up in a system that teaches them how to teach. I just was throwing away some paperwork from all that I've collected over the years about how they paid $1,500 to a person in Piedmont school to develop a plan on how to discipline the class. I talked to an old-time teacher that when that first came into the school district, she said, I have been teaching long enough. I am not going to sit here and list all of the things that a kid does wrong so we can come up with a plan on how to deal with these kids. I deal with it on the spot. The independence of individual thinking is gone because we all got to do everything the same way. Well, our school district has proven over the last several years that we've got a terrible graduation gap. These kids don't know how to read and write when they go out to get a job. We've got a terrible problem. We don't do critical thinking in these classrooms anymore, so I'm going to ask the question. I know the answer, but I am going to ask the question. If you've taught the people how to be puppets, do you think they're going to be the one that controls the puppets on the top, the puppeteer? No. They're going to do what they're told. They're going to lockstep into whatever pathway they've been led down. And they're not going to do what I was taught to do. I've been a very independent person, and you tell me no, I'm going to walk right around you and say, I dare you. I dare you to tell me that. But we can't do that anymore because, gee, we all got to go along to get along. And you know, we've had these silly things about, oh, if you say the wrong word to a person, you are damaging their ego. That came in the 70s. I saw it in the one school that my son was in. And I did not go along to get along with that philosophy because where is our independence if we have to all be saying the same thing and all be listening to the same thing and agreeing with everything? That's what's going on in schools today, so we can't expect these people to be independent thinkers. That's the way I see it, and I could be wrong, but that's the way I see it.
Well, Marcia, I appreciate your viewpoint. As you know, you and I disagree on some of the
things
stuff.
we
I'm a strong advocate of public education, but you're absolutely correct. There is no critical thinking going on in our schools anymore. And when it comes down to, for example, the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act, when our schools are violating the law, and they're the ones that are teaching our children, and it should give you a raise for concern when the school board in Duluth does absolutely nothing to admonish the superintendent of them. And they can just willfully go and violate the law whenever they feel like, and nobody says anything about it. And those are the people that are teaching our children. It should raise a lot of red flags that when what we learn in government 101 and civics 101 in high school was that one, you obey the law and you tell the truth. I think those are the summaries of what we all learned in school. And that isn't even practicing by the schools that are supposed to be teaching future citizens how to be involved citizens in our country. It does really concern me about that. I agree with your concern, even though I think there are some public schools that do try to be good citizens. Duluth Public Schools are not one of them.
Well, and I don't disagree that there aren't some good schools out there. I'm just saying on the whole, what we've seen, certainly here in this district. But the other thing is, I like to watch PBS because the rest of the channels, excuse me, that's not worth my time. And they've had a series on dictators and how they came to power. How did they come to power? Illiterate people were willing to follow a charismatic leader who got them into socialism and then bankruptcy like that we're dealing with in Venezuela, which is just deja vu from some of the countries that went that way. And so an illiterate people is going to follow a charismatic person. I know that Grunstedt thinks he's charismatic. He certainly has 6 board members that think he's charismatic because they do whatever he says. They don't think, they don't reason, and they don't challenge him. And that's where it is. You have to read outside of the Duluth News Tribune. You have to analyze and put together things. But if you aren't taught critical thinking when you're young, you don't all of a sudden learn it when you get to be older. It takes time.
It's a real problem.
It is a big problem.
I'd like to think that somebody finally holding governments accountable like I did on data practices, even though we got a minor settlement, it should have been enough to raise red flags up for the people of Duluth that there's something wrong going on with our governments here.
Well, let's hope. We can only hope. And I hope that you still have the energy to continue on in this because there's certainly much more to be done. And I commend you for, even after being off the board, to pursue it because let's hope my program and the Reader, where you're writing now in very good articles, and then what Lauren Martell, bless his heart, continues to do by writing in the Reader. So we've got the, I'm sorry, the Zenith. The Zenith, I mean, Art writes in the Zenith and Lauren Martell writes in the Reader, excuse me, I'm sorry about that. So I want you to give your website and anything else you want to say for just another minute.
Oh, my website is Truth in Duluth, and I don't have a lot on there. I'm not a social media guy. I try to put stuff out there. There's a lot of information on my website about the achievement gap we have on our schools, the low graduation rates, the east-west divide between Duluth. I think all those are signs of failure in our school system. And of course, now I have some information on how they violated the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act and my lawsuit. And people can find that, but more important, give me a call anytime. My phone number's on my website, and be glad to talk to you, Marcia. Anybody else that think government is there for the people and are there for good, if they want to make that better. I'm not going away because this is one of the things I enjoy doing. I think it's important that government is accountable and answers to people. And I'm one of those people, and hey, I'm not going away.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time and coming in again, Art. And you can get into my program on the YouTube as soon as we get it up, Just the Facts, or my name, Marcia Stromgren, and you can find us on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. Bye now.